What calls to us from the blank spaces on the map? Is it the promise of discovery, or the echo of something lost, a memory just beyond the horizon? For centuries, sailors and scholars, mystics and mapmakers have filled the world's empty corners with islands that shimmer and vanish. Places not quite of this earth, but never quite absent from our imagination. Come with us as we set sail on the tides of rumour and shadow in search of the world's most intriguing lost lands and phantom isles. High Brazil, the veiled isle beyond the mist. On a foggy morning in 1872, the crew of the British ship HMS Delight sailed west of Ireland, scanning the horizon for land. Suddenly, through the mist, they spotted something extraordinary, a shadowy island where none should exist. The sailors watched as green hills seemed to rise from the sea, only for the vision to vanish as quickly as it appeared. They weren't the first to witness this strange phenomenon, and they wouldn't be the last. For centuries, people have reported glimpses of a mysterious island off Ireland's west coast, a place known as High Brazil. Some say it's a trick of the light, others believe it's a doorway to another world. But whatever the truth, High Brazil has become one of the greatest unsolved mysteries of the Atlantic. The legend of High Brazil stretches back through the centuries. In the oldest Irish tales, it wasn't just an island, it was a magical realm, a place where the rules of time and nature didn't apply. Monks whispered about it in their stone monasteries, describing a land where wounds healed, sorrow faded, and the weary could find peace. The island's name, sometimes spelled O Brazil or the Great Island of the West, echoed through medieval manuscripts and the songs of fishermen. It became a symbol of hope, a place where the impossible might just be possible. By the 14th century, High Brazil had made its way onto the maps of Europe. Medieval cartographers drew it as a small, perfectly round island west of Ireland, sometimes split by a narrow channel. They labelled it Brazil or Brasil, and placed it with a confidence that suggested they believed it was as real as any other land. The famous Catalan Atlas of 1375 showed High Brazil boldly, as if daring explorers to find it. For generations, its presence on maps lured sailors and dreamers, promising riches, wisdom, or even eternal youth. Stories of High Brazil spread far beyond Ireland. Portuguese mariners spoke of mysterious islands beyond the known world. English explorers planned expeditions to seek out the fabled land. In 1497, John Cabot set sail from Bristol chasing tales of High Brazil. He never found it, but his journey helped spark the age of exploration. Over the years, other sailors claimed to have landed on its shores. In 1674, Captain John Nisbet described a land rich with silver and gold, inhabited by people older than memory. Yet, no solid evidence ever surfaced. Each new voyage returned with only stories and more questions. The stories of High Brazil changed with every telling. Some described it as a land of endless summer, where fruit trees bent low with golden apples and streams ran clear and sweet. Others saw it as a fortress of granite cliffs, guarded by magical creatures and spirits who turned away the unworthy. There were tales of travellers who, lured by the island's lights, landed on its shores only to become lost in a maze of mist and shadow, returning years later with memories that faded like dreams at dawn. For the people of Ireland, High Brazil was never just a place on a map. It was an idea, a hope, a promise. It appeared in the prayers of mothers whose sons set out on the open sea, and in the songs sung by fishermen before dawn. Some called it the other world, a parallel realm where the dead found peace and the living might, if only for a moment, glimpse the secrets of the universe. Medieval manuscripts described it as O Brazil, a place so close yet forever out of reach. Eyewitness accounts continued into the modern era. In 1684, the Irish historian Roderick O'Flaherty wrote that High Brazil was visible to some, not to others, even when standing side by side. Fishermen returned from sea claiming to have seen the island on the horizon, only for it to dissolve into mist. Some said that on clear days the outline of High Brazil could be seen from the cliffs of Connemara, its green hills taunting the watchers with promises of a better world. But not all the stories were hopeful. Some whispered that High Brazil was a place of enchantment, where mortals who set foot on its soil might never return, or if they did, they would be forever changed. One local legend tells of a man who vanished for a single night, only to return aged beyond recognition, his hair white as snow, his eyes filled with secrets no one could understand. Even into the 19th and 20th centuries, sightings continued. The crew of the HMS Delight wasn't alone. Local fishermen along Ireland's west coast still share tales of strange lights and sudden mists. Some say that on rare occasions the island appears as a shadow in the distance, only to vanish if one dares to approach. As the centuries passed, the question of High Brazil's reality became more urgent. The Age of Enlightenment brought new tools, compasses, sextants and charts drawn with scientific precision. The Royal Navy, determined to solve the mystery, sent ships to the exact coordinates marked on old maps. They found only empty ocean. That round, inviting island that had tempted generations was gone. Modern technology has only deepened the mystery. Oceanographers have scanned the seafloor west of Ireland using sonar and satellites. They've mapped every ridge and plateau, searching for any sign of a lost island. Some researchers point to the Porcupine Bank, a shallow plateau that rises from the seafloor in the right area. When conditions are just right, the bank can create unusual waves and reflections, tricks of light that might be mistaken for land. But there's no evidence of a true island ever existing there. Satellite imagery has also been used to search for High Brazil. High-resolution photos show nothing but open water, no hidden landmass, no secret island waiting to be discovered. Expeditions have come and gone, each returning with the same result. The Atlantic keeps its secrets well, yet the stories persist. Some scientists suggest that the legend of High Brazil might be rooted in real phenomena. Under certain weather conditions, a type of mirage called a superior mirage can make distant objects appear above the horizon. This could explain why so many sailors, over so many centuries, reported seeing an island that wasn't really there. It's also possible that volcanic activity or shifting sands created temporary islands that later disappeared beneath the waves. Modern scholars have plenty of theories about High Brazil. Some believe it was inspired by the Porcupine Bank, as mentioned earlier. Others argue that High Brazil was simply a wishful mirage, born from the minds of sailors hungry for land after weeks at sea. The Atlantic is a master of illusions. Clouds, fog, and light can play tricks on even the most experienced eyes. There are also stories of hoaxes and misunderstandings. In the age of exploration, rumours of new lands could inspire hope, fear, or even greed. Some explorers may have exaggerated their discoveries to win fame or funding. Others may have mistaken floating debris, seaweed, or even flocks of birds for land. Over time, these stories grew and changed, blending fact and fiction until the line between them disappeared. A few people still cling to more mystical explanations. Ireland has a long tradition of thin places, locations where the barrier between this world and the next is fragile, where spirits walk and miracles happen. In this view, High Brazil was never meant to be found by those who sought it for gain. It was a gift, a vision, a blessing reserved for the pure in heart or the desperate in need. Antillia, the island of 7 cities. The year is 711 and everything is falling apart. Moorish armies have crossed into Spain and Christian kingdoms are crumbling like houses built on sand. In the chaos, as families flee north with whatever they can carry, 7 bishops make a desperate decision. These men of God watch their cathedrals burn and their people scatter, but they refuse to surrender their faith. They gather the most sacred treasures they can find, golden chalices, holy relics, ancient manuscripts, and load them onto ships. Then they sail west into the unknown Atlantic, seeking something that seems impossible, a new promised land where they can rebuild their world. This is how the legend of Antillia begins, the island of 7 cities born from desperation and hope. The 7 bishops, whose names history has forgotten, but whose story lives on, become the founders of a Christian paradise beyond the reach of any earthly army. They don't just escape the Moors, they create something new, something perfect. Each bishop builds a city around a great cathedral, and together they establish a realm where faith reigns supreme and war is just a distant memory. The island's name tells its own story, Antillia, meaning the land before, or opposite, the known world. In medieval minds, this wasn't just a legend, it was as real as Rome or Paris. The 7 cities were described in amazing detail. Cathedrals so tall their bells could be heard for miles, gardens that grew fruit year-round, granaries that never emptied, and springs that could heal the sick. It was a place where winter never came and angels walked among the people. The legend of Antillia didn't just inspire hope, it shaped entire cultures. In Portugal and Spain, the story became part of the national identity. Court poets wrote epic verses about the 7 bishops, describing their journey as a new exodus. Artists painted murals showing ships sailing toward golden cities rising from the sea. The story spread through Europe like wildfire, carried by monks, merchants and travellers who embellished it with each telling. Medieval mapmakers treated Antillia as historical fact. They drew it on their most important charts, the Pizzigano chart of 1424, the maps that Christopher Columbus studied. The island appeared in different shapes depending on who was drawing it. Sometimes it looked like a crooked fish swimming through the Atlantic. Other times it was shown as 7 separate islands, each one perfect and round. The most detailed maps included harbour names, mountain heights and river courses, as if the cartographers had actually walked the beaches themselves. The Catholic Church embraced the legend, seeing it as proof that God would protect the faithful even in the darkest times. Priests told the story from their pulpits, using it to encourage Christians facing persecution. The 7 bishops became unofficial saints, their journey seen as a model of faith in action. Churches across Spain and Portugal displayed paintings of the 7 cities, their golden spires reaching towards heaven. In Portuguese and Spanish literature, Antillia became a symbol of hope and renewal. Writers used it to represent the possibility of starting fresh, of building a perfect society based on Christian values. The story influenced everything from religious texts to romantic poetry. Even today, scholars find references to the 7 cities in manuscripts that seem to have nothing to do with exploration or geography. The story of Antillia wasn't unique. Cultures around the world have told similar tales of lost paradises and hidden lands. The Greeks had Atlantis, a perfect civilization that vanished beneath the waves. Celtic mythology spoke of the otherworld, a realm where the gods lived and mortals could find eternal happiness. Norse legends described islands in the Western Sea where brave warriors could find glory and peace. What makes these stories similar is their timing. They usually emerge during periods of crisis or change. When the real world becomes too harsh, people create imaginary worlds that offer everything the real one lacks. Antillia appeared during the Muslim conquest of Spain, just as Atlantis emerged from the chaos of ancient conflicts. These legends serve as emotional safety valves, giving people hope when reality offers little. The Buddhist tradition speaks of Shambhala, a hidden kingdom where enlightened beings live in perfect harmony. Hindu texts describe Dvarka, a golden city that exists in another dimension. Even Native American tribes have stories of cities across the western waters, places where spirits dwell and the natural world remains unspoiled. These parallels suggest that the human need for perfect worlds is universal, crossing cultural and religious boundaries. What's particularly interesting about Antillia is how it blends Christian theology with exploration mythology. The 7 bishops aren't just refugees, they're pioneers, combining spiritual mission with geographical discovery. This combination would later influence the way Europeans thought about the New World, seeing exploration as both a physical and spiritual journey. The legend of Antillia wasn't just a story, it was a call to action. Portuguese Prince Henry the Navigator commissioned real expeditions to find the 7 cities, offering substantial rewards to any captain who could locate them. The Portuguese crown issued official patents for the discovery and governance of islands that existed only in legend. This wasn't casual dreaming, it was serious business backed by serious money. The search began in earnest during the 15th century. Ship after ship left from the Azores and Madeira, their holds packed with supplies for long voyages into the unknown. Most returned empty-handed, but some brought back tantalizing hints. Sailors reported seeing strange birds with unusual plumage, suggesting land beyond the horizon. Others described mysterious ocean currents and sudden calms, as if the sea itself was hiding something. The most compelling accounts came from crews who claimed to have actually reached Antillia. In 1447, a Portuguese ship supposedly landed on the island during a storm. The crew described beaches of black sand and endless forests. They filled their water barrels from streams that tasted like wine and collected sand that seemed to glow in sunlight. But when they tried to return, fog rolled in and the island vanished like a mirage. These stories multiplied across Europe. Spanish fishermen claimed their nets pulled up coins with unknown markings, currency from the 7 cities they insisted. Portuguese merchants found debris washing ashore after storms, carved wood with Christian symbols, pottery glazed in impossible colours, parchment fragments with Latin text that scholars couldn't fully translate. Christopher Columbus believed in Antillia so strongly that he included it in his calculations for reaching Asia. He thought the island would serve as a perfect stopping point, a place where his ships could resupply before continuing to the Indies. When he convinced the Spanish crown to fund his voyage, Antillia was part of his sales pitch. In seeking the 7 cities, he accidentally discovered America. The Spanish crown took the search seriously. In 1516, they gave Diego de Ordas an official commission to find and govern Antillia, complete with detailed instructions for establishing trade with the 7 bishops. The expedition found nothing but empty ocean. As more voyagers failed to locate the island, cartographers quietly began removing it from their maps. By the late 16th century, Antillia had faded from official geography, replaced by the very real continents that Columbus had stumbled upon. Even though Antillia disappeared from maps, it never really died. Sailors continued reporting strange lights in the western Atlantic. 7 beacons flickering in formation, always just beyond reach. Coastal priests heard confessions from fishermen who swore they'd heard cathedral bells ringing through the fog. The legend adapted, surviving in folk tales and local traditions long after scholars had dismissed it. Modern researchers offer various explanations for the Antillia legend. Some suggest it began with confused reports about the Azores or Canary Islands, their details distorted by distance and wishful thinking. Others point to natural phenomena, atmospheric mirages that can make clouds look like solid land to desperate sailors. A few theorists propose that Antillia represents cultural memory of ancient voyages, folk recollections of trips taken centuries before Columbus. The most intriguing possibility comes from geology. The Atlantic Ocean floor shows evidence of ancient volcanic activity, underwater mountains that once rose above the waves before sinking back into the depths. Could Antillia have been real, briefly, before some prehistoric disaster pulled it beneath the sea? Oceanographers and historians continue to debate this question, knowing that the ocean keeps its own records written in stone and sediment far below human reach. The legend of Antillia influences everything from literature to video games. Science fiction writers use it as inspiration for stories about lost civilizations and parallel dimensions. Historians study it to understand how myths shape exploration and discovery. Marine archaeologists search for evidence of pre-Columbian voyages, wondering if some truth might lie buried beneath centuries of storytelling. The story also continues to influence how we think about utopian societies. Just as the 7 bishops created a perfect Christian commonwealth, modern thinkers imagine ideal communities based on their own values. The legend reminds us that humans have always dreamed of starting over, of building something better than what they left behind. As we continue our journey through these mysterious waters, Antillia sails with us, not as a destination we might reach, but as a symbol of the eternal human desire to transform hope into reality. Pepys Island, the Admiral's Mirage. The South Atlantic Ocean in the 1680s was a dangerous place. Spanish treasure ships crossed these waters carrying gold and silver from the New World, while pirates and privateers hunted them like wolves. The Falkland Islands had been spotted but barely explored, and vast stretches of ocean remained unmapped. It was in this wild frontier that one of history's strangest phantom islands would be born. The man who would create this mystery was William Ambrose Cowley, a privateer sailing under English colours aboard the ship Revenge. Cowley wasn't your typical explorer. He was part pirate, part adventurer, and part mapmaker, making his living by attacking Spanish ships and charting unknown waters. Samuel Pepys, the man whose name would become attached to this phantom island, lived a very different life. He was a government official in London, famous for keeping detailed diaries about his daily routine. Pepys worked for the British Navy, managing supplies and administration from the comfort of his office. He never sailed to the South Atlantic, never faced storms or battles at sea, and certainly never set foot on any remote island. Yet his name would become forever linked to one of the ocean's greatest mysteries. In 1683, Cowley was sailing through the lonely waters near the Falkland Islands when he made what he believed was the discovery of his lifetime. Through the mist and spray he spotted land, a green, inviting island that seemed like paradise in the harsh South Atlantic. According to Cowley's report, the island was covered with lush vegetation, its shores teeming with seals and seabirds. Fresh water streams ran down from the interior, and the whole place looked like the perfect refuge for sailors stranded in these dangerous waters. Cowley knew the value of what he thought he'd found. An island in this location would be incredibly useful for any nation trying to control trade routes to the Pacific. Ships needed places to stop for water, food, and repairs, especially in the treacherous waters around Cape Horn. More importantly, such an island could serve as a base for attacking Spanish treasure fleets or defending against enemy raiders. Being a smart man who understood politics, Cowley named his discovery Pepys Island after Samuel Pepys, who controlled the British Navy's purse strings. It was a calculated move. By honouring Pepys, Cowley hoped to gain favour with one of the most powerful men in England's maritime establishment. Whether Cowley truly admired Pepys or simply wanted his support, the name stuck, and the island became part of official British records. When news of the discovery reached London, it caused considerable excitement. Here was potentially valuable territory in the South Atlantic, perfectly positioned for British strategic interests. Mapmakers quickly added Pepys Island to their charts, describing it as fertile and well-watered, with abundant wildlife and excellent harbours. The island was officially claimed for the British Crown, becoming part of the growing empire without anyone ever setting foot on it again. But there was one small problem. Nobody could find the island. When Captain John Strong sailed to Cowley's reported coordinates in 1690, he found nothing but empty ocean. At first, this wasn't particularly worrying. Navigation in the 17th century was far from precise, and small errors in position were common. Everyone assumed that either Strong had made a mistake, or Cowley's original position was slightly off. The island was still out there somewhere, waiting to be rediscovered. More expeditions followed, each one confident they would succeed where others had failed. Spanish captains, concerned about an English island in what they considered their territory, sent ships to investigate. They returned empty-handed. French explorers, always eager to challenge British claims, dispatched their own expeditions. They too found nothing but ocean. With each failed search, the mystery of Pepys Island deepened. The island's position on maps began to shift like a mirage. Early charts showed it in one location, but as searches failed, cartographers started moving it around, hoping to reconcile Cowley's description with the reality that nobody could find it. Sometimes Pepys Island appeared north of the Falklands, sometimes south, sometimes east, sometimes west. Its position became as uncertain as the sea itself. Captain Woodes Rogers, a famous privateer who would later become governor of the Bahamas, made several attempts to locate the island in the early 1700s. Rogers was no amateur. He was the man who rescued Alexander Selkirk, the real-life Robinson Crusoe, from Juan Fernandez Island. His journals reveal growing frustration as he sailed to where Pepys Island should have been, only to find endless ocean. Even Rogers, tough as he was, began to doubt whether the island had ever existed. The Spanish were equally determined to solve the mystery. If the island existed, they wanted to claim it before the British could establish a permanent presence. Spanish captains scoured the waters around the Falklands using the best navigational equipment available. They interviewed local sailors, studied ocean currents and wind patterns, and carefully mapped every rock and reef they encountered. Despite their efforts, they found no trace of Cowley's paradise. As the 18th century progressed, theories about Pepys Island multiplied. Some experts suggested that Cowley had simply mistaken the Falkland Islands themselves for a new discovery, perhaps seeing them from an unusual angle or in strange weather conditions. The Falklands were, after all, green and filled with seals and birds, matching Cowley's description perfectly. Others proposed more exotic explanations. Maybe Cowley had encountered a massive iceberg covered with dirt and vegetation, making it appear like solid land from a distance. In the cold waters where he was sailing, such icebergs were common and could drift for months before melting. A large iceberg covered with debris could easily fool a tired sailor into thinking he'd found a new island. Some critics went further, suggesting that Cowley had seen exactly what he wanted to see. The human mind, especially under stress or driven by hope, can create patterns from random shapes. Clouds, shadows on the water, or distant ice formations might have been transformed by wishful thinking into the island Cowley desperately wanted to discover. A few skeptics proposed an even more damning theory, that Cowley had invented the entire story. Perhaps he needed to justify his time in the South Atlantic. Or maybe he wanted to impress his superiors by claiming a great discovery. Privateers were known for exaggeration, and adding a fake island to the maps wouldn't have been unprecedented. By the late 1700s, the British Navy was growing tired of fruitless searches. Official attitudes began to shift towards skepticism. Pepys Island still appeared on some maps, but often marked with question marks or warnings about its uncertain existence. The island was becoming a ghost, fading from official records even as it lingered in popular imagination. The final blow came in the early 1800s when systematic surveys of the South Atlantic were conducted using the most advanced instruments of the era. These expeditions had the resources and technology to settle the question definitively. They sailed to every location where Pepys Island had ever been reported, used precise instruments to determine their exact position, and conducted thorough searches of the surrounding waters. Their conclusion was unambiguous. There was no island. The locations where Pepys Island was supposed to exist showed only deep ocean, with no underwater features that could have once been above sea level. Gradually, mapmakers began removing Pepys Island from their charts. The process took decades. Some maps continued showing it well into the 19th century with warnings about its doubtful existence, but eventually, the Phantom Island vanished from official geography. Now we understand much more about what might have caused Cowley's sighting. The South Atlantic is notorious for atmospheric conditions that create powerful optical illusions. Temperature differences between air masses can cause superior mirages, making distant objects appear closer, larger, or in impossible locations. Under the right conditions, the Falkland Islands themselves might have appeared to be in a completely different position, creating the illusion of a separate landmass. There's also the psychological factor of expectation. Cowley was sailing in waters where islands were known to exist. The Falklands had been sighted, though not yet properly explored. He would have been primed to discover the new land in the area. When something ambiguous appeared on the horizon, whether clouds, ice, or a distant mirage, his mind might have interpreted it as the island he hoped to find. Modern oceanographic surveys have confirmed what those 19th century expeditions discovered. There is no island where Pepys Island was supposed to be. Satellite imagery, sonar mapping, and GPS navigation have eliminated any possibility that a significant landmass was somehow overlooked. The mystery of what Cowley actually saw may never be solved, but we can be certain it wasn't a permanent island. The Phantom Islands of the Arctic, fleeting shadows on the ice. The Arctic Ocean is Earth's ultimate laboratory for studying phantom islands, and nowhere is this more clear than in the case of Crocker Land. When Robert Peary reported seeing this massive landmass from Ellesmere Island in 1906, he wasn't just making another explorer's claim, he was presenting science with a puzzle that would take decades to solve. Peary described mountains and valleys stretching across the northwestern horizon, terrain that looked as real and solid as any land he'd ever seen. But Crocker Land raised fundamental questions that went beyond simple geography. How could experienced Arctic explorers, men who had spent years learning to read ice and weather, all see the same non-existent island? What does this tell us about the physics of light in extreme environments? And most importantly, what can Phantom Islands teach us about how our planet's most remote regions actually work? The scientific questions surrounding Arctic Phantom Islands go deeper than optical illusions. These sightings occurred in one of Earth's most dynamic environments, where massive ice sheets constantly shift, where ocean currents carry enormous icebergs thousands of miles, and where the boundary between sea and land changes with the seasons. Understanding Phantom Islands means understanding the complex interactions between atmosphere, ocean, and ice that make the Arctic unlike anywhere else on Earth. When Donald Macmillan led his expedition to find Crocker Land in 1913, he was conducting one of history's first systematic studies of Arctic mirages, even though he didn't realize it at the time. The search for Crocker Land and other Arctic Phantom Islands led scientists to examine the geological structure of the Arctic Ocean floor in unprecedented detail. What they found was a complex underwater landscape that helps explain why Phantom Islands appear where they do. The Arctic Ocean sits on top of several tectonic plates that have been moving and colliding for millions of years. These movements created underwater ridges, valleys, and seamounts that affect water temperature, ocean currents, and ice formation, all factors that influence how light behaves in the Arctic atmosphere. Sediment cores taken from the Arctic Ocean floor tell the story of dramatic changes over geological time. Layers of sediment show periods when the Arctic was much warmer, when forests grew where ice now dominates, and when sea levels were hundreds of feet different than today. These cores also reveal something else important: evidence of massive ice sheets that extended far beyond their current boundaries, creating temporary land masses that could have been real islands for thousands of years before melting away. The geological evidence shows that the Arctic has always been a place of change. Fossil records indicate that mammoth tusks and ancient tree stumps regularly wash up on Arctic beaches, carried by currents from underwater deposits that were once dry land. This geological activity creates a constantly shifting environment where the line between permanent and temporary land is never clear. Some of what explorers saw as phantom islands might have been based on cultural memories or indirect evidence of real land masses that existed in the recent geological past. The study of tectonic activity in the Arctic has also revealed how underwater features affect the formation of mirages. Seamounts and ridges beneath the ice create upwelling currents that bring warmer water toward the surface. This creates the temperature differences in the air that are necessary for superior mirages, the type of optical illusion that makes distant objects appear as solid land on the horizon. The geological structure of the Arctic Ocean floor literally creates the conditions for phantom islands to appear. Modern technology has revolutionized our understanding of Arctic phantom islands. Sonar mapping has revealed the true shape of the Arctic Ocean floor, showing exactly what lies beneath the ice where explorers thought they saw land. High-resolution sonar can detect underwater features as small as a few meters across, and these surveys have found no hidden islands or unexpected land masses in the areas where phantom islands were reported. The ocean floor in these locations shows typical deep water features: abyssal plains broken by occasional ridges and seamounts, but nothing that could support permanent land above sea level. Satellite imagery has provided even more definitive proof. Modern satellites can photograph the Arctic in multiple wavelengths of light, revealing details invisible to the human eye. These images show the exact locations where phantom islands were supposed to exist, and in every case they reveal only ice, water, or temporary ice formations. More importantly, satellites can track these features over time, showing how ice islands and large icebergs move through the Arctic Ocean, sometimes staying in one area long enough to be mistaken for permanent land. GPS technology has eliminated the navigation errors that once made phantom island sightings harder to verify. When Peary reported seeing Crocker Land, determining exact position required complex calculations using the sun and stars, with significant room for error. Modern expeditions can pinpoint their location within a few meters and return to the exact same spot where phantom islands were reported. These precise revisits have consistently found nothing but ocean. Advanced atmospheric monitoring has revealed the true nature of Arctic mirages. Weather stations throughout the Arctic now measure temperature, humidity, and air pressure at multiple altitudes, providing the data needed to predict when superior mirages will occur. Scientists can now create the same optical effects in laboratory conditions, proving that atmospheric conditions alone are sufficient to create convincing phantom islands. Specialized cameras that photograph in infrared and other wavelengths can even capture these mirages in detail, showing how they form and disappear. DNA analysis has added another layer of understanding. Scientists studying ice cores and sediment samples can identify microscopic organisms that reveal what the Arctic environment was like in the past. This biological evidence confirms the geological data, showing that while the Arctic has changed dramatically over time, there's no evidence for the large mountainous islands that explorers reported seeing. Atmospheric physicists who specialize in Arctic conditions explain that the phantom island phenomenon is actually quite predictable. The Arctic creates perfect conditions for superior mirages because of its unique combination of extremely cold surface temperatures and the way air masses move across the flat ice surface. When dense, cold air near the ice is topped by warmer air, light rays bend in ways that lift images of distant objects high above the horizon. These lifted images can appear as detailed, solid-looking land masses, complete with mountains, valleys, and coastlines. Oceanographers studying the Arctic have found that the ocean structure plays a crucial role in creating phantom islands. Cold surface water and warmer deep water create temperature boundaries that affect how ice forms and moves. Large ice islands, some covering several square miles, can drift through the Arctic for years, appearing and disappearing based on ocean currents. These real but temporary features could explain some phantom island sightings, especially when viewed from great distances through Arctic haze. Geologists studying Arctic tectonics point out that the region is more geologically active than most people realize. The Lomonosov Ridge, an underwater mountain range that runs across the Arctic Ocean, is still being mapped and studied. While this ridge doesn't create islands where phantom islands were reported, it shows that the Arctic Ocean floor is complex and dynamic. Some geologists suggest that temporary volcanic activity or underwater landslides could have created brief islands that later disappeared, though no direct evidence for this has been found. Polar historians who study exploration note patterns in phantom island sightings that support the atmospheric explanation. Most sightings occurred during specific weather conditions, clear, cold days with unusual atmospheric pressure patterns. The descriptions of phantom islands also share common features that match what we know about superior mirages. They appear on the horizon, seem to move or change shape when approached, and disappear when weather conditions change. Psychologists studying decision-making under extreme conditions explain how the harsh Arctic environment could make even experienced explorers more likely to see what they expected or hoped to see. The combination of physical stress, isolation, and the pressure to justify expensive expeditions created psychological conditions where phantom islands seemed not just possible but necessary. The human brain's pattern recognition system, evolved to spot danger and opportunity quickly, can create meaningful shapes from ambiguous visual information, especially when survival might depend on finding land. The study of Arctic phantom islands has revealed fundamental truths about how our planet's atmosphere and oceans interact in extreme environments. Understanding these interactions is crucial as climate change rapidly alters the Arctic. The same atmospheric conditions that create phantom islands also affect weather patterns, ice formation, and ocean circulation throughout the Northern Hemisphere. Scientists studying these phenomena are building better models of how the Arctic system works, which helps predict how changes in the Arctic will affect global climate. The research has also advanced our understanding of human perception and decision-making in extreme environments. The phantom island phenomenon shows how even highly trained professionals can be fooled by natural illusions, especially when those illusions confirm what they hope or expect to see. This research has practical applications for modern polar operations, space exploration, and any situation where humans must make critical decisions based on limited visual information in harsh conditions. Buss Island, the phantom in the North Atlantic. Imagine this. It's 1578, and you're aboard a sturdy fishing vessel called the Emmanuel of Bridgewater, lost in the icy waters between Iceland and Greenland. Your ship has been separated from Martin Frobisher's fleet during a violent Arctic storm, and you're alone in waters no European has ever seen before. Through the mist and spray, something appears on the horizon: land. Not the familiar coast of Greenland or Iceland, but something completely new. An island rises from the grey sea, offering hope of shelter and fresh water. You mark its position carefully, draw its outline, and name it Buss Island after your ship type. But here's the mystery. When other sailors go looking for your discovery, some find it exactly where you said it would be, while others find nothing but empty ocean. For the next 2 centuries, Buss Island would appear and disappear like a ghost, challenging everything explorers thought they knew about the northern seas and creating one of history's most enduring maritime mysteries. The story of Buss Island begins with Martin Frobisher's third voyage to the Arctic in 1578. Frobisher was searching for gold in the Northwest Passage, a route to Asia that would make England rich and powerful. But the Arctic had other plans. Storms scattered his 15-ship fleet, and the Emmanuel of Bridgewater found itself alone in uncharted waters. The crew, experienced fishermen from England's West Country, weren't explorers by trade, but they knew how to read the sea and weather. When they spotted what appeared to be an island, they approached it with the careful eye of men whose lives depended on accurate navigation. The island they reported was substantial, not just a rock or small outcrop, but a significant landmass with what appeared to be a rocky coastline and vegetation. They recorded its position as carefully as 16th century navigation allowed, using compass bearings and estimated distances. When the Emmanuel rejoined Frobisher's fleet, the crew shared their discovery with the other captains, who dutifully added it to their charts. Within years, Buss Island appeared on maps across Europe, sometimes drawn round, sometimes elongated, but always positioned in the same general area between Iceland and Greenland. Early cartographers treated Buss Island as established fact. The island appeared on the famous Mercator maps, in Dutch atlases, and on English Admiralty charts. Each mapmaker added their own details. Some showed it as a single island, others depicted it as a small archipelago. The most detailed charts included depth soundings around the island, harbour locations, and even notes about dangerous currents. These weren't tentative markings, but confident assertions that Buss Island was as real as any other feature in the North Atlantic. The island's strategic importance grew as European powers expanded their reach into the Arctic. Located roughly halfway between Iceland and Greenland, Buss Island would be perfectly positioned as a way station for ships travelling the northern routes. The Danish crown, which controlled Greenland, took particular interest in the island's supposed location. English merchants saw it as a potential base for whaling operations, while Dutch traders included it in their calculations for Arctic routes to Asia. The testimonies of those who claimed to see Buss Island are remarkably consistent, which made the mystery even more puzzling. In 1605, Captain James Hall, sailing for the Danish crown, reported encountering the island exactly where the Emmanuel's crew had placed it. Hall described it as low-lying and rocky, surrounded by treacherous, shallow waters that made approach dangerous. His report was taken seriously by Danish authorities, who were mapping their Arctic territories with increasing precision. Other sightings followed a similar pattern. Sailors would report seeing the island from a distance, describing rocky shores, what appeared to be sparse vegetation, and the general outline that matched earlier reports. Some claimed to have sailed close enough to see details: bird colonies on the cliffs, the colour of the rocks, even the sound of waves breaking on the shore. These weren't vague glimpses, but detailed observations by experienced mariners who knew the importance of accurate reporting. What made these testimonies particularly credible was the calibre of the witnesses. These weren't amateur adventurers or unreliable storytellers, but professional sailors, naval officers, and experienced Arctic navigators. Captain Thomas Shepherd reported seeing Buss Island in 1671, describing it as a fair island with clear landmarks. His account was detailed enough that the Royal Navy considered it reliable evidence for the island's existence. Fishing crews also reported encounters with Buss Island, though their hut accounts were often more practical than poetic. They described rich fishing grounds near the island, with cod so plentiful that ships could fill their holds in days rather than weeks. Some fishermen claimed to have actually landed on the island to repair nets or take on fresh water, though these accounts were often second-hand and difficult to verify. The pattern of sightings was intriguing. Most occurred during specific weather conditions, clear days with good visibility, but often with unusual atmospheric conditions. Witnesses frequently mentioned that the island seemed to shimmer or change appearance as they watched, sometimes appearing closer or farther away than expected. Some reported that the island seemed to move or shift position slightly, which they attributed to currents or their own navigation errors. By the 1670s, the question of Buss Island's existence had become more than just a matter of curiosity. It was a navigation hazard and a diplomatic issue. The Royal Navy decided to settle the matter definitively. In 1675, they dispatched Captain John Wood with explicit orders to find Buss Island, survey its shores, and determine its true nature. Wood was given the best equipment available and clear instructions to be thorough and scientific in his approach. Wood's expedition was methodical and comprehensive. He sailed to every location where Buss Island had been reported, using multiple navigation methods to ensure accuracy. He searched in various weather conditions, knowing that atmospheric effects might make the island visible only under specific circumstances. His crew included experienced Arctic navigators who were familiar with the tricks that northern waters could play on unwary sailors. The results were conclusive. There was no island at any of the reported locations. Wood found deep water where shallow reefs were supposed to be, empty ocean where rocky shores should have appeared, and no evidence of the substantial landmass that had been described by multiple witnesses. His report to the Admiralty was clear and unambiguous. Buss Island did not exist as a permanent geographical feature. However, Wood's expedition did make some interesting discoveries. The waters where Buss Island was supposed to be located were indeed unusual. There were strong currents, areas where warm and cold water mixed, and occasional patches of unusual ice formation. These conditions created optical effects that could potentially explain some of the sightings. Wood noted that under certain atmospheric conditions, distant icebergs, or even reflections of Greenland's coast could appear as solid land. Modern oceanographic surveys have confirmed Wood's findings with far greater precision. Sonar mapping of the seafloor in the area shows deep water, with no underwater features that could support land above sea level. Satellite imagery has photographed the region thousands of times under various conditions, never showing any sign of a permanent island. GPS navigation allows modern ships to return to the exact coordinates where Buss Island was supposed to be, finding only empty ocean. The scientific explanation for Buss Island involves a combination of natural phenomena and human psychology. The most likely explanation is that the original sighters saw a large tabular iceberg, a massive, flat-topped ice formation that can be hundreds of square kilometers in size. These icebergs, broken off from Arctic ice shelves, can drift for years, accumulating debris and even supporting primitive plant life on their surfaces. From a distance, especially in poor visibility, such an iceberg could easily be mistaken for a permanent island. The atmospheric conditions in the North Atlantic also play a crucial role. The region is famous for superior mirages, optical illusions that lift images of distant objects above the horizon, making them appear as solid land. These mirages can be incredibly detailed and convincing, showing what appears to be rocky coastlines, vegetation, and even buildings. They're caused by temperature inversions in the atmosphere, where warm air sits above cold air, bending light rays in ways that create these ghostly images. There's also the possibility of psychological factors at work. Once Buss Island appeared on maps, sailors expected to see it. The human brain is excellent at finding patterns and creating meaning from ambiguous visual information, especially when there's an expectation of what should be there. A distant iceberg, unusual cloud formation, or even the play of light on water could be interpreted as the expected island, particularly by crews who'd been at sea for weeks or months. The persistence of the Buss Island legend also reflects the limitations of 16th and 17th century navigation. Determining exact position at sea was extremely difficult, and small errors could place a ship miles from where the crew thought they were. This meant that failures to find the island could be attributed to navigation errors rather than the island's non-existence. The lack of reliable long-distance communication also meant that conflicting reports took years to be compared and reconciled. Some historians suggest that the original sighting might have been deliberately fabricated or exaggerated. The crew of the Emmanuel, separated from their fleet and perhaps lost, might have created the story of discovering new land to justify their absence, or to claim some glory from the expedition. However, the consistency of later sightings by unrelated crews makes this explanation less likely than the natural phenomena theories. The Isle of Demons, a place of banished souls. In the cold waters off Newfoundland, where icebergs drift like silent monuments and fog can swallow the world in minutes, there exists a legend that has haunted sailors for over 4 centuries. The French called it l'Île des Démons, the Isle of Demons, a place where the boundary between our world and something far darker grows dangerously thin. Picture, if you will, the year 1542, when the known world ended just beyond Europe's shores, and the new world was still a realm of mystery and terror. Jean-François de la Roque de Roberval, a powerful French nobleman, commanded an expedition to claim territory in this unknown land, but aboard his ship sailed a young woman whose fate would become intertwined with one of history's most chilling maritime legends. Marguerite de la Roque was Roberval's niece, a woman of noble birth who had committed the unforgivable sin of falling in love with one of the ship's officers. When Roberval discovered their romance, his fury was swift and merciless. In an act that shocked even the hardened sailors of his crew, he ordered Marguerite, her lover, and her elderly servant to be abandoned on an island that every mariner feared, a place where strange howls echoed through the night, where shadows moved without anything to cast them, and where the very rocks seemed to whisper threats in languages that predated human speech. The three were put ashore with meagre supplies, a little food, some basic tools, and a single musket for protection. As Roberval's boat rowed away, Marguerite watched her uncle's ship disappear into the mist, knowing she had been condemned to survive in a place that existed somewhere between the physical world and the realm of nightmares. What followed was a 2-year ordeal that would test not just her will to live, but her very sanity. One by one, her companions died. First her lover, succumbing to the harsh conditions and what some whispered were supernatural afflictions, then the elderly servant, who spent her final days speaking to invisible presences and begging forgiveness from things that cast no shadows. Alone on the Isle of Demons, Marguerite faced horrors that she would later describe only in careful, guarded words. She spoke of voices in the wind that seemed to know her name, of dreams so vivid they felt more real than waking life, and of a constant presence watching her from just beyond the edge of sight. For over 2 years she survived by her wits and, she claimed, by the strength of her faith, learning to hunt seals and birds, to read the treacherous weather patterns, and to hide in caves when supernatural storms swept across the island. When Basque fishermen finally rescued her, they found a woman forever changed by her ordeal, someone who had looked into the darkness and somehow found the strength to stare back. The legend of l'Île des Démons became deeply embedded in French colonial culture, serving as both a cautionary tale and a symbol of human resilience in the face of the unknown. Marguerite's story spread throughout Europe, inspiring poets, playwrights and chroniclers who saw in her ordeal a perfect blend of romance, adventure and supernatural terror. French writers used her tale as a framework for exploring themes of punishment, survival and redemption, while the Catholic Church sometimes cited her story as an example of how faith could triumph over evil. The island appeared on French maritime charts for centuries, its location shifting from map to map as if it possessed a will of its own. Sometimes, cartographers drew it as a jagged crescent near the Strait of Belle Isle, other times as a perfect circle hidden among the maze of islands at the mouth of the Gulf of St. Lawrence. These maps often included warnings written in elegant script: "Demons dwell here," "Cursed ground," or simply "Beware." The uncertainty of its location only added to its mystique. An island that couldn't be pinned down seemed to move according to its own supernatural logic. In Newfoundland's fishing communities, the Isle of Demons became part of local folklore, woven into the stories that sailors told during long winter nights. Fishermen would speak of it in hushed tones, sharing tales that grew more elaborate with each telling. Some described ships being pushed ashore by invisible winds onto beaches of black sand where no tide ever reached. Others told of twisted forests where trees bent into unnatural shapes, their branches reaching down like grasping fingers. The most terrifying stories involved the voices, sounds that might once have been human but had been corrupted into something that hurt to hear, calling out in languages that predated civilization. The legend also influenced French colonial policy and exploration patterns. Some historians suggest that fear of the Isle of Demons actually shaped settlement patterns in the region, with certain areas being avoided not for practical reasons but because of supernatural dread. The story became a tool for maintaining discipline aboard ships, with captains warning unruly crew members about the fate that awaited those who defied proper authority and Christian morality. The Isle of Demons belongs to a rich tradition of cursed islands found in cultures around the world, suggesting that the human psyche has always projected its deepest fears onto isolated land masses surrounded by threatening waters. In Greek mythology, the island of Lemnos was inhabited by women who had been cursed by Aphrodite, while the sirens lured sailors to their doom on rocky islands scattered throughout the Mediterranean. Celtic traditions speak of the otherworld islands, places where the fairy folk dwelt and where mortals who landed might never return or might return centuries later, unchanged by time but forever altered by their experience. Norse mythology contributes its own version with islands inhabited by trolls and other supernatural beings, places where the normal rules of physics and mortality didn't apply. In these stories, as in the tale of l'Île des Démons, the islands serve as testing grounds where heroes must confront not just physical dangers, but psychological and spiritual challenges that reveal their true character. The common thread running through all these legends is the idea that certain places exist outside the normal order of things, where the supernatural world intrudes into our reality. Japanese folklore tells of islands inhabited by oni, demons that torment any humans unfortunate enough to land there. Pacific Islander traditions describe phantom islands that appear and disappear according to the will of angry spirits, places where the rules of navigation break down and where even experienced sailors can become hopelessly lost. African coastal legends speak of islands where the ancestors dwell, places that can be visited only under specific conditions and where the living must prove themselves worthy or face terrible consequences. What makes these stories particularly interesting is how they often emerge during periods of exploration and cultural contact, suggesting that the unknown territories represent not just geographical mysteries but psychological frontiers where different worldviews collide. The Isle of Demons appeared during the early period of French exploration in North America, when European settlers were struggling to understand and adapt to an environment that challenged everything they thought they knew about the natural world. As European exploration of the North Atlantic became more systematic and scientific, investigators began searching for the real location behind the Isle of Demons legend. The most likely candidates were the rocky islands scattered along Newfoundland's coast, places like Belle Isle, Quirpon Island, and various unnamed outcrops that match some aspects of the legendary descriptions. These islands were indeed harsh and forbidding, with treacherous currents, unpredictable weather, and an abundance of seals and seabirds that could produce the strange sounds that terrified early visitors. Belle Isle, in particular, attracted attention from researchers trying to solve the mystery. Located in the Strait of Belle Isle between Newfoundland and Labrador, this island was known for its dangerous approach, sudden weather changes, and eerie acoustic properties caused by wind flowing through natural rock formations. The island's history includes numerous shipwrecks and stories of castaways who struggled to survive in its harsh environment. Some historians argue that Belle Isle could easily have been the real location where Marguerite de la Roque was abandoned, with the supernatural elements added later to explain the psychological trauma of her experience. Modern archaeological investigations have searched for evidence of Marguerite's presence on various candidate islands. While no definitive proof has been found, researchers have discovered artifacts from early European presence in the region, including tools, pottery fragments, and the remains of temporary shelters that could have been built by castaways. However, the harsh climate and centuries of weather have made it nearly impossible to establish clear connections to any specific historical event. Scientific analysis of the acoustic phenomena reported around these islands has provided rational explanations for many of the supernatural sounds that terrorized early visitors. Wind patterns, echo effects from rock formations, and the calls of various marine mammals can combine to create audio experiences that seem otherworldly, especially to people already primed by fear and superstition to interpret unusual sounds as evidence of supernatural presence. Marine biologists studying the region have noted that seal colonies, whale migration patterns, and bird populations could account for many of the demonic sounds reported by early sailors. Harbour seals in particular can produce vocalizations that sound remarkably human-like, especially when heard from a distance or filtered through fog and wind. When combined with the psychological stress of being stranded in a hostile environment, these natural sounds could easily be interpreted as supernatural manifestations. Despite centuries of rational explanation and scientific investigation, the legend of l'Île des Démons continues to captivate modern audiences, appearing in contemporary literature, film, and popular culture as a symbol of humanity's enduring fascination with the unknown and unexplained. Modern writers have reimagined Marguerite's story through various lenses, feminist interpretations that see her as a symbol of women's resilience against patriarchal oppression, psychological studies that examine survival trauma, and supernatural thrillers that embrace the darker elements of the original legend. The story has also found new life in the growing field of psychogeography, the study of how specific places affect human consciousness and behavior. Researchers investigating the psychological impact of isolation and extreme environments often reference Marguerite's experience as an early documented case of how prolonged stress and solitude can blur the boundaries between reality and hallucination. Her careful, guarded descriptions of her supernatural encounters are now studied as examples of how the human mind processes trauma and creates meaning from chaos. In Newfoundland and the Maritime Provinces, the Isle of Demons has become part of the region's cultural identity, featured in tourism materials, local festivals, and historical presentations that celebrate the area's rich tradition of maritime folklore. The story serves as a bridge between the region's indigenous traditions, which include their own legends of supernatural islands and water spirits, and the European colonial experience, creating a unique cultural synthesis that reflects the complex history of the North Atlantic. Modern sailors and fishermen in the region still occasionally report unusual experiences that echo elements of the old legend: strange sounds in the fog, unexplained lights moving against the current, moments when every instinct screams that they are not alone in the vast emptiness of the northern waters, reminding us that while we may have mapped every island and charted every current, the human imagination continues to find mystery in the places where sea meets sky, and some stories refuse to be explained away by science, living on in that liminal space where fear and wonder dance together in the spray of ancient waves. Sannikov Land, the mirage of the Arctic, is 1811, and the Russian Empire stretches across 2 continents, its northern borders dissolving into the frozen wilderness of the Arctic Ocean. This is a world where winter temperatures can drop to minus 50 degrees Celsius, where the sun disappears for months at a time, and where survival depends on reading the subtle signs that separate life from death in one of Earth's most unforgiving environments. The New Siberian Islands, a chain of remote landmasses scattered across the Arctic Ocean north of Siberia, represent the edge of the known geography. Beyond them lies only ice, darkness, and the unknown. It's in this harsh landscape that we meet Yakov Sannikov, a man whose name would become forever linked to one of the Arctic's greatest mysteries. Sannikov wasn't an aristocrat or a naval officer, but a practical man who made his living in the most dangerous way possible, hunting mammoth tusks and fox pelts in the frozen wasteland. Born into the tough life of Siberia, he'd spent decades learning to survive where others would perish. He could read ice conditions like a book, finding food and shelter in places that looked like empty death to inexperienced eyes. This was a man who understood the difference between wishful thinking and reality, between the hallucinations that extreme cold could bring and the solid evidence of his own experienced senses. The Russian government had good reason to trust Sannikov's reports. The early 19th century was an age of expansion and discovery, when finding new territory could shift the balance of global power. For Russia, with its vast but largely unexplored northern territories, any new land in the Arctic Ocean could mean new resources, new trade routes, and new strategic advantages. The Arctic represented both opportunity and mystery, a region where the maps ended and possibilities began. Standing on the frozen shore of Kotelny Island in that bitter winter of 1811, Sannikov gazed northward across the pack ice and saw something that would captivate explorers for the next century. Through the clear Arctic air, dark mountains rose against the horizon, appearing solid and permanent in a world of constantly shifting ice and snow. The land seemed substantial, not just a small outcrop or ice formation, but a significant landmass with visible peaks and valleys stretching across the northern skyline. Sannikov called his discovery simply Zemlya, the Russian word for land, but history would remember it as Sannikov Land. His description was detailed and confident. He reported seeing not just mountains, but what appeared to be low-lying areas between the peaks, suggesting a landmass of considerable size. The sighting wasn't a brief glimpse, but an extended observation, giving him time to study the features and convince himself of what he was seeing. When Sannikov reported his discovery to Russian authorities, they took his claims seriously. This wasn't some amateur adventurer spinning tales for attention, but one of Russia's most experienced Arctic explorers providing what seemed like reliable intelligence about new territory. The implications were enormous. If Sannikov had indeed spotted unknown land, it could represent a significant addition to the Russian Empire and potentially change understanding of Arctic geography. The report sparked immediate interest in St. Petersburg, where government officials and scientists debated the possibilities. Some were skeptical, knowing how the Arctic could play tricks on even experienced observers. Others were excited by the prospect of new discoveries, seeing Sannikov Land as proof that the Arctic Ocean might contain more surprises than anyone had imagined. Maps began to include tentative markings showing possible land north of the New Siberian Islands, though cartographers were careful to indicate the uncertain nature of these additions. The first official expedition to find Sannikov Land began in 1821, led by Lieutenant Pyotr Anziu of the Russian Imperial Navy. Anziu was given substantial resources and clear instructions: survey the New Siberian Islands thoroughly and investigate reports of land to the north. His expedition spent 3 years in the Arctic, using dog sleds to cross frozen seas and camping on ice when solid ground couldn't be found. The challenges were immense, navigating by compass in regions where magnetic fields could confuse instruments, surviving temperatures that could kill in minutes, and crossing ice that might crack open without warning. Anzu's teams pushed farther north than any previous expedition, reaching Bennett Island and establishing it as the northernmost point of the new Siberian archipelago. From this remote outpost, they reported seeing what appeared to be land on the distant horizon, lending credibility to Sannikov's original sighting. However, every attempt to reach this mysterious land ended in failure. The ice conditions were too dangerous. Storms would force retreats, or the landmarks they thought they'd spotted would vanish as they approached. These tantalizing near discoveries only deepened the mystery surrounding Sannikov land. Anzu's men reported other intriguing signs that suggested land might indeed exist to the north. They observed birds flying in formation toward the northern horizon, behavior that typically indicated nearby nesting grounds. Changes in sea ice color and consistency hinted at different water conditions that might be caused by nearby land masses. Most mysteriously, several expedition members reported detecting the scent of earth and vegetation on northern winds, an impossibility unless there was solid ground upwind from their position. The search for Sannikov land became one of the great obsessions of 19th century Arctic exploration. In 1879, American explorer George Washington DeLong launched the ill-fated Jeannette expedition, partly motivated by the belief that Sannikov land existed and could be reached from the western Pacific. DeLong's ship became trapped in pack ice and was eventually crushed, leading to one of the Arctic's greatest tragedies. Even as DeLong and his crew faced death, they reported seeing land to the north, adding their testimony to the growing collection of sightings. The legend attracted some of the era's most accomplished Arctic explorers. Vilhjalmur Stephenson, the Canadian explorer who discovered several real Arctic islands, became convinced that Sannikov land existed and could be found using proper techniques. Stephenson pioneered a new approach to Arctic exploration, travelling light and living off the land rather than relying on heavy supply trains. His expeditions covered vast distances and survived in conditions that would have destroyed traditional expeditions. But even Stephenson's innovative methods couldn't locate the elusive land mass. The breakthrough that would finally solve the mystery of Sannikov land came with the development of aviation. In the 1930s, Soviet pilots began conducting systematic aerial surveys of the Arctic Ocean, covering in hours what had taken ground expeditions years to traverse. Flying at altitudes that provided clear views of the surface, these aircraft should have easily spotted any significant landmass in the area where Sannikov land was supposed to exist. Flight after flight over the presumed location revealed the same result: nothing but ice and open water. The aerial surveys were conducted under various weather conditions and at different times of year, but the conclusion was always identical. There was no land where generations of explorers had believed it to be. The pilots reported seeing the complex patterns of pack ice, occasional polar bears, and the dark waters of leads between ice flows, but no mountains, valleys, or solid ground that could account for the persistent sightings. The final nail in Sannikov land's coffin came with modern oceanographic surveys. Detailed sonar mapping of the Arctic Ocean floor revealed the true topography beneath the ice, showing deep water north of the New Siberian Islands, with no underwater features that could have supported land above sea level. The ocean depth in the area where Sannikov land was supposed to exist measured thousands of meters, making it impossible for any landmass to have existed there within human memory. These technological advances forced a complete re-evaluation of the century-long search. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Sannikov land had never existed as a permanent geographical feature. The question then became not whether the land was real, but what had caused so many experienced explorers to see something that wasn't there. Scientists understand exactly what Sannikov and the other explorers were seeing. The Arctic creates some of the world's most convincing optical illusions, known as superior mirages or fata morgana. These phenomena occur when cold air near the ice surface is topped by warmer air at higher altitudes, creating layers with different densities that bend light in unusual ways. This bending effect can lift images of distant objects, icebergs, ice formations, or even the pack ice itself, high above the horizon, making them appear as solid land complete with mountains and valleys. The psychological factors involved in these sightings are equally important to understand. Arctic explorers faced enormous pressure to succeed, having invested years of preparation and risked their lives on the promise of discovery. In such circumstances, the human mind naturally looks for signs of success, and ambiguous shapes on the horizon can easily be interpreted as the land that explorers desperately hope to find. The phenomenon is made worse by the physical and mental stress of Arctic travel. Exhaustion, cold, and isolation all contribute to a state where the boundary between perception and wishful thinking becomes blurred. Modern research has also revealed the role that ice islands played in creating the Sanikoff Land legend. These massive formations, created when thick sea ice breaks away from ice shelves, can cover several square kilometers and drift with ocean currents for years or even decades. From a distance, especially in poor visibility conditions, these ice islands can appear remarkably similar to permanent land, complete with hills and valleys formed by pressure ridges and wind sculpting. Climate change is now transforming the Arctic in ways that would amaze the explorers who searched for Sanikoff Land. The region is warming faster than anywhere else on Earth, melting ice that has been permanent for thousands of years and revealing ocean floor that has never been seen by human eyes. Satellite imagery now shows the Arctic Ocean changing dramatically from year to year, with new passages opening and ice formations that would have been landmarks for earlier explorers disappearing entirely. Sandy Island, the island that vanished in the age of satellites, November 2012. Dr. Maria Seaton is staring at her computer screen in complete disbelief. She's aboard the Australian research vessel Southern Surveyor, somewhere in the Coral Sea between New Caledonia and Australia, and according to every map she's consulted, Google Earth, official nautical charts, GPS databases, there should be an island directly ahead of them. Not just any island, but Sandy Island, a 25-kilometre stretch of land that had been marked on maps for over a century. Instead, there's nothing but endless blue water stretching to the horizon. The ship's sonar readings confirm what her eyes are telling her. They're sailing through water that's 1,400 metres deep, with no trace of the landmass that millions of people had seen on their maps and GPS devices. Sandy Island, it seems, had never existed at all. But here's what makes this discovery truly mind-bending. This wasn't some ancient legend or medieval superstition. This was a phantom island for the digital age, a place that had appeared on the most authoritative maps of the 20th and 21st centuries, was included in official shipping charts, and was even marked as a no-fly zone on aviation maps. For decades, pilots had been instructed to avoid its airspace. Ships were warned to steer clear of its dangerous shores, and anyone could zoom in on its dark outline through Google Earth. So how, in an age when satellites can spot a car from space, had an entire island managed to hide its non-existence for more than a century? The story of Sandy Island begins not in the digital age, but in the golden era of Pacific whaling. The island's first documented appearance was on a French nautical chart from 1876, where it was labelled Sable Island, French for Sand Island. The chart was created based on reports from whaling ships that had been working the waters of the Coral Sea, though the specific vessel or captain who first reported the sighting has been lost to history. This was during a time when commercial whaling was booming across the Pacific, with ships from America, Europe, and Australia crisscrossing the ocean in search of sperm whales and right whales. From that initial French chart, Sandy Island began its remarkable journey through the world's mapping systems. It appeared on British Admiralty charts in the 1880s, was included in German navigational atlases by the 1890s, and gradually found its way into the databases of maritime organisations around the world. Each time it was copied from one authoritative source to another, its existence became more established, more certain. The island's coordinates were refined over time, settling at 19°13 as 159°56'E, and its shape became more defined, appearing as a dark, elongated mass that resembled a submarine when viewed from above. What's fascinating about Sandy Island's historical record is how consistent it remained across different sources. Unlike many phantom islands that shifted location or changed shape between different maps, Sandy Island stayed remarkably stable. This consistency actually worked against discovering the truth, because it suggested that multiple independent sources had confirmed the island's existence. In reality, it was the same single erroneous report being passed down through generations of mapmakers, each trusting the work of their predecessors. The island's inclusion in official admiralty charts gave it serious credibility. These weren't tourist maps or casual atlases. They were the navigation tools used by commercial shipping, military vessels, and scientific expeditions. When the British Admiralty included Sandy Island in their charts, they were essentially vouching for its existence based on their reputation as the world's premier maritime authority. Other nations followed suit, and by the early 20th century, Sandy Island had become as established as any real landmass in the Pacific. Here's where the Sandy Island mystery becomes truly strange. Despite being on maps for over a century, virtually no one claimed to have actually visited it. This absence of eyewitness accounts should have been a red flag, but it was explained away by the island's remote location and the fact that it appeared to be uninhabited. The Coral Sea was not a major shipping route, and there was no economic reason for vessels to make the detour to investigate a small, apparently barren island. The few reports that did exist were indirect and vague. Some shipping logs from the early 1900s mention avoiding the Sandy Island area due to dangerous currents or bad weather, but these references seem to be based on chart warnings rather than actual sightings. A handful of fishing vessel reports from the 1950s and 1960s described seeing dark patches or suspicious areas in the vicinity of Sandy Island's coordinates, but these accounts are so general they could describe anything from floating debris to shadows on the water. Aviation records provide an even stranger perspective on Sandy Island's supposed existence. From the 1940s onward, the island was marked as a no-fly zone on aeronautical charts, with pilots instructed to maintain a minimum altitude when passing over the area. This created a bureaucratic catch-22. Because planes were required to avoid the island, no pilot ever got close enough to confirm whether it actually existed. The flight restrictions, originally implemented as a safety measure, inadvertently helped preserve the island's mythical status. Military records from World War II and the Cold War era show that various naval forces included Sandy Island in their operational planning, treating it as a potential navigation hazard or strategic point. Australian and American military exercises in the Coral Sea throughout the 1960s and 1970s included protocols for the Sandy Island region, despite the fact that no military personnel had ever reported seeing the island during these operations. The most intriguing testimonies came from amateur radio operators and maritime enthusiasts in the 1980s and 1990s. Several reported receiving mysterious radio signals from the direction of Sandy Island's coordinates, brief transmissions that couldn't be traced to any known station. While these reports were probably unrelated to the Phantom Island, they added another layer of mystery to an already puzzling situation. The Australian research team that finally debunked Sandy Island wasn't looking for phantom islands. They were conducting a routine geological survey of the Coral Sea, studying underwater mountain ranges and collecting samples from the ocean floor. Sandy Island was simply a waypoint on their journey, a place they planned to briefly examine before moving on to their primary research sites. Dr. Maria Seaton and her colleagues had equipped their vessel with state-of-the-art sonar equipment, underwater cameras, and satellite navigation systems that could pinpoint their location to within a few meters. When they arrived at Sandy Island's coordinates, the scientific instruments told a clear story. The water depth was 1,400 meters, far too deep for any island to exist. The sonar readings showed an ancient seafloor with no signs of recent geological activity that might have caused land to suddenly sink beneath the waves. Core samples taken from the ocean bottom revealed sediment layers that had been undisturbed for thousands of years, providing definitive proof that no landmass had existed in this location within human memory. The team's findings were immediately cross-referenced, with satellite imagery from multiple sources. High-resolution photographs from various Earth observation satellites showed only open ocean at Sandy Island's supposed location. Historical satellite images dating back to the 1970s confirmed that there had never been any land visible from space in this area. The black polygon that appeared on Google Earth wasn't based on satellite imagery at all. It was a digitized version of the old maritime charts, essentially a computer-generated representation of the original error. Oceanographic data from the region provided additional evidence against Sandy Island's existence. Ocean current patterns, water temperature readings, and marine life distribution all indicated typical deep-sea conditions with no influence from nearby land. If a 25-kilometre island had existed in this location, it would have created distinctive patterns in the surrounding marine environment, none of which were present. The scientific investigation also revealed how the error had propagated through modern mapping systems. When Google began creating its digital maps in the early 2000s, the company relied on existing datasets from government agencies and commercial mapping companies. These databases included Sandy Island, faithfully copied from the century-old charts that had been based on those original, unverified whaling ship reports. The island's inclusion in Google Maps gave it unprecedented global visibility, but this visibility was based on historical error rather than scientific observation. The investigation into Sandy Island's origins led researchers to several plausible explanations for the original sighting that had started the whole mythology. The most compelling theory involves pumice rafts, floating masses of volcanic rock created by underwater eruptions. These natural phenomena can be massive, sometimes covering hundreds of square kilometers, and can drift across ocean basins for months or even years before finally breaking apart and sinking. The timing supports this pumice raft theory perfectly. The 1870s saw significant volcanic activity throughout the Pacific Ring of Fire, including several major eruptions in the region where Sandy Island was supposedly located. A large pumice raft created by one of these eruptions could have drifted through the Coral Sea exactly when the whaling ships were operating in the area. From a distance, especially in poor visibility conditions, such a raft would look remarkably like a solid island, complete with what appeared to be rocky shores and elevated terrain. Another possibility involves the phenomenon of superior mirages, where unusual atmospheric conditions can make distant objects appear as solid land on the horizon. In the vast emptiness of the Pacific, where the nearest real land might be hundreds of kilometers away, these optical illusions can be particularly convincing. Cloud formations, particularly the type that sits low on the horizon, can create the appearance of mountainous islands under the right conditions. The human factor in the original sighting cannot be ignored. Navigation in the 19th century was challenging and imprecise, with ships' positions calculated using dead reckoning, celestial observations, and educated guesswork. Errors of hundreds of kilometers were common, meaning that a ship's crew might think they were in one location when they were actually somewhere else entirely. This could lead to reports of islands in the wrong places, or islands that existed only in the navigator's calculations. There's also the psychological aspect of expectation and wishful thinking. Whaling ships spent months at sea, and spotting new land was always significant. It could mean fresh water, food, shelter, or simply a break from the monotony of ocean travel. In such circumstances, the human mind is primed to interpret ambiguous shapes on the horizon as the land it hopes to find. The persistence of Sandy Island through the digital age reveals how errors can become amplified rather than corrected by technology. When computer databases were created from existing maps, the same mistakes that had been perpetuated by hand copying were now embedded in digital systems. Instead of ground-truthing these databases against actual observation, mapping companies and government agencies simply digitized their existing records, assuming that if something had been on official charts for decades, it must be accurate. St. Brendan's Island, the monk's miraculous voyage. The year is 512, and the wild Irish coast is shrouded in mist that seems to hold ancient secrets. On the towering cliffs of Kerry, in a small stone monastery that faces the endless Atlantic, an old monk named Brendan stares into the grey waters. For months now, visions have haunted his dreams. He believes an angel has visited him, revealing a paradise that lies somewhere across the Western Sea, a sacred land where the faithful can walk alongside God himself, where every tree bears perfect fruit, and crystal-clear streams flow through valleys of eternal spring. This is no ordinary holy man. Brendan the Navigator has already sailed to distant shores, founding monasteries across the Celtic world and bringing Christianity to forgotten islands. But this vision calls to something deeper than religious duty. It awakens the ancient Irish hunger for the other world, that mystical realm beyond the horizon where mortals might touch the divine. In Celtic tradition, the sea was not a barrier but a doorway, and beyond its mists lay islands of wonder that existed outside the normal flow of time. What follows would echo through the centuries, inspiring countless voyages and appearing on maps long after Columbus crossed the Atlantic. But like all great adventures, it begins with a single moment of faith, a prayer whispered into the salt wind and the scraping sound of a leather boat being dragged across rocky shores. According to the Navigatio Sancti Brendani, written 3 centuries after Brendan's death, the monk gathered 17 faithful companions to build their vessel in the ancient Irish way. They crafted a wooden frame and stretched ox hide across it, waterproofing the leather with animal fat and blessing every plank with holy water. To our modern eyes, this boat would seem impossibly fragile, yet it would carry them into waters that challenge even today's strongest ships. Their 7-year journey reads like a fever dream painted in salt spray and starlight. They discovered islands where the very ground was made of crystal that sang in the wind. Trees bore fruit that glowed like captured starlight, and mountains breathed fire into the sky, while seas turned to perfect glass beneath their boat. They met hermits who had lived for centuries on nothing but divine grace, witnessing miracles that bent the laws of nature like light through water. But it was the final destination that would capture medieval Europe's imagination for 1,000 years, the promised land of the saints. Brendan and his companions walked across this paradise for 40 days without ever reaching its borders. Golden apples hung heavy from silver trees, and in every gentle breeze they heard the voice of God himself whispering secrets of creation. When they finally prepared to leave, an angel appeared with a promise that shook the foundations of medieval thought. This island would be revealed again when Christians needed it most. The tale spread through medieval monasteries like wildfire across dry grass. Here was proof that paradise existed not just as a promise for the afterlife, but as a real place in the physical world, waiting for the pure of heart to discover it. The Navigatio was copied by hand countless times, translated into dozens of languages, and became one of the Middle Ages' most beloved books. Monks who had never seen an ocean larger than a village pond dreamed of sailing west to find St. Brendan's Island. But the story did far more than inspire religious devotion. It literally shaped how people saw their world. Medieval mapmakers, working with fragments of knowledge and leaps of faith, placed St. Brendan's Island on their charts with the same confidence they showed for Rome or Jerusalem. It appeared on the famous Hereford map of 1300, the stunning Catalan Atlas of 1375, and hundreds of other maps that guided explorers for centuries to come. The island's location was never fixed, which only added to its supernatural appeal. Some maps placed it far to the west, near the very edge of the known world. Others showed it closer to Ireland, sometimes north of the Azores, sometimes south of the Canary Islands. A few ambitious mapmakers even drew multiple islands, suggesting that Brendan had discovered not just one paradise but an entire archipelago of holy lands waiting to be found. This geographic uncertainty wasn't seen as a problem but as proof of the island's divine nature. It was a place that existed beyond normal geography, visible only to the faithful and hidden from those who sought it for worldly gain. The shifting location confirmed what many believed. This wasn't an ordinary island, but a piece of heaven itself, moving according to God's will across the ocean's vast expanse. Remarkably, similar stories of mystical islands beyond the western horizon appear in cultures around the world. The ancient Greeks spoke of the Hesperides, islands at the world's edge where golden apples grew and the blessed dead found eternal peace. Celtic mythology was filled with tales of Tir na Nog, the land of eternal youth, where heroes could live forever if they were brave enough to sail beyond the sunset. Norse sagas told of islands where the gods themselves walked among mortals, and even far-off Japan had legends of Horai, floating islands where immortals dwelled in perfect harmony. These stories share common threads that speak to something deep in human nature, the belief that somewhere beyond our daily struggles lies a perfect world where suffering ends and joy never fades. Perhaps it's no coincidence that these tales emerged from maritime cultures, people who daily faced the ocean's vast mystery and saw in its endless horizon the promise of something greater. As European exploration exploded in the 15th and 16th centuries, the search for St. Brendan's Island became serious business backed by royal treasuries and ambitious captains. Portuguese sailors, with their own Celtic connections through ancient trade routes, reported regular sightings during voyages to the Azores and Madeira. Spanish explorers claimed to glimpse the mysterious land from the Canary Islands, always shimmering on the horizon but somehow never reachable no matter how fast they sailed toward it. The Canary Islands became the epicenter of the most frequent and detailed sightings. People living on La Palma and Tenerife often reported seeing a mysterious landmass to the west, clearly visible on exceptionally clear days but gone by the time ships could be organized to investigate. The locals called it San Brendan, their version of St. Brendan's name, and sightings became so regular that the Spanish crown began taking them seriously. In 1570, Portuguese explorer Fernão Dulmo received official permission from Spain to find and settle St. Brendan's Island. Armed with eyewitness testimony and his own careful calculations, he sailed west from the Canaries with high hopes and royal backing, following the exact direction where the island had last been spotted. After weeks of searching, he found nothing but endless blue water stretching to every horizon. But failure only seemed to fuel more attempts. In 1604, Spain dispatched Captain Gaspar Pérez de Acosta with a well-equipped crew and the most advanced navigation instruments available. Though he reported seeing what might have been the island's mountain peaks during one tantalizingly clear moment, his expedition returned empty-handed, adding another chapter to the island's legend of being perpetually just out of reach. This pattern repeated itself through the 17th and 18th centuries like a cosmic joke played by the ocean itself. Reliable witnesses would report sightings, official expeditions would launch with great fanfare, and searchers would return with tales of optical illusions, strange cloud formations, or simply empty seas that mocked their efforts. Yet, belief in St. Brendan's Island remained stubbornly strong, fueled by an unshakable faith that paradise was waiting somewhere in the vast Atlantic for those worthy enough to find it. The scientific revolution of the 18th century finally offered rational explanations for the persistent sightings. Scholars began to understand superior mirages, rare atmospheric conditions that could make distant objects appear to float impossibly above the horizon. Around the Canary Islands, these mirages could transform mountain peaks on far-off islands into the illusion of a separate landmass, creating the perfect conditions for Phantom Island sightings. But scientific explanations couldn't completely kill the dream. The island had become woven into Canary Islands folklore and cultural identity in ways that transcended mere geography. Local fishermen continued to speak of seeing it in certain weather conditions, always beautiful and inviting, but always vanishing like morning mist when approached. Some claimed that time moved differently there, that a single day spent on the island might equal a year in the outside world. Across centuries of reported sightings, descriptions of the island remained remarkably consistent. Witnesses described rolling green mountains wrapped in silver mist, valleys bursting with flowers in colours that had no earthly names, and beaches of sand that seemed to glow with inner light. Some saw evidence of human habitation, monasteries, or even entire cities that might have been built by Brendan's followers over the centuries. Others described it as completely wild and untouched, a perfect paradise that existed exactly as God had created it. As the Atlantic Ocean was systematically mapped and explored, St. Brendan's Island slowly faded from serious geographic consideration. The last official government search was launched in 1721 when Spanish naval officer Gaspar Dominguez was dispatched to investigate fresh reports of sightings. His methodical search of the waters west of the Canaries turned up absolutely nothing, and his detailed report effectively ended official interest in the Phantom Island. Even as maps became more accurate and the age of exploration filled in the ocean's blank spaces, the story of St. Brendan's Island lived on in literature, art, and popular imagination. The 19th century Romantic movement embraced it as a perfect symbol of humanity's eternal search for paradise, a reminder that some mysteries are too beautiful and important to be solved by cold scientific analysis alone. Modern scholars have spent considerable effort trying to separate historical fact from medieval legend in the Navigatio. Some believe that Brendan or other Irish monks may have actually reached Iceland, the Faroe Islands, or even the coast of North America, truly remarkable achievements for 6th century sailors in leather boats. Others argue that the entire story should be read as an allegory, a spiritual journey disguised as a physical voyage across dangerous waters. But perhaps debating whether Brendan's Island was real misses the deeper point of why it mattered so profoundly to medieval people. In their worldview, the physical and spiritual realms were intimately connected, and a place could be both geographically real and symbolically meaningful at the same time. The island served as a bridge between the hardships of daily life and the promise of divine possibility, proof that wonder and miracle were still possible in a world that often seemed harsh and unforgiving. Maybe that's why sightings continued long after most of the Atlantic had been thoroughly mapped and explored. People saw St. Brendan's Island not necessarily because it was physically there, but because they desperately needed it to be there. In a world that was growing smaller and more measured with each passing year, the island represented the preservation of mystery and the hope that miracles still waited just beyond the horizon for those brave enough to seek them. The island of Thule, edge of the known world, the Mediterranean world of 325 BCE, was a place of bustling trade routes and confident scholarship, where Greek philosophers debated the shape of the earth from marble academies and merchants counted profits from amber, tin and precious metals that flowed in from mysterious northern lands. Most educated people believed they understood the boundaries of their world, the familiar inland sea surrounded by known continents, with perhaps some scattered islands beyond the Pillars of Hercules before the ocean dropped off into the realm of the gods. Beyond the misty shores of distant Britain, surely there was nothing but endless water and the edge of creation itself. Into this world of comfortable certainties came a man who would shatter every assumption about what lay beyond the horizon. Pythias of Massalia was not your typical Greek scholar content to theorize from dusty libraries. He was a practical navigator from the bustling port city we now call Marseille, where foreign sailors brought tales of distant shores and strange peoples who lived under different stars. Unlike his contemporaries who preferred the safety of established trade routes, Pythias had an insatiable hunger to see these mysterious lands for himself. The port of Massalia was perfectly positioned to fuel such ambitions. Ships arrived daily carrying amber from the foggy Baltic regions and tin from the legendary Cassiterides, the tin islands that most Greeks knew only as names whispered in marketplace rumours. These goods travelled overland through dangerous territories controlled by hostile tribes, making them expensive and unreliable. Pythias saw opportunity where others saw only risk. If he could find a sea route to these northern sources of wealth, he could revolutionise Mediterranean trade while satisfying his own burning curiosity about the world's hidden corners. When Pythias announced his plan to sail beyond the Pillars of Hercules and explore the Atlantic Ocean, his fellow Greeks thought he had lost his mind. The Atlantic was the domain of sea monsters and divine wrath, where ships might sail off the world's edge or be crushed by the weight of the sky pressing down on the water. No Greek had ever ventured into those waters and returned with reliable information about what lay beyond the Mediterranean's familiar boundaries. But Pythias was methodical in his apparent madness. He had mastered the art of celestial navigation, could calculate latitude using the positions of stars, and had carefully studied every fragment of information brought back by Phoenician traders who claimed to have reached the distant Tin Islands. More importantly, he had secured backing from Massalia's merchant community, practical men who understood that enormous profits awaited anyone brave enough to establish direct trade routes to the northern sources of precious metals and amber. The voyage that followed was nothing short of extraordinary. Pythias guided his ship through the narrow strait at Gibraltar, then turned north along the Atlantic coasts of Spain and Gaul. He crossed the treacherous waters of what we now call the English Channel, circumnavigated the entire island of Britain, and then continued north into waters no Mediterranean sailor had ever seen. Along the way, he documented phenomena that would have seemed impossible to his stay-at-home contemporaries. Tides that rose and fell with tremendous force, summer nights that lasted barely an hour, and peoples who lived in ways that challenged every Greek assumption about civilization and barbarism. But it was his account of a land he called Thule that would capture imaginations and puzzle geographers for the next 2,000 years. According to Pythias, Thule lay 6 days sailing north of Britain in a region where the normal rules of nature seemed suspended. Here, he claimed, summer nights were illuminated by a sun that barely kissed the horizon before rising again, creating an eternal twilight that must have seemed magical to someone accustomed to the predictable darkness of Mediterranean nights. Even more mysterious was his description of the sea around Thule. The water became thick and sluggish, he reported, neither land nor water nor air, but a mixture of all three. a description that sounds like pure fantasy until you realise he was probably encountering sea ice for the first time in his life. How do you explain frozen ocean to people who have never seen anything but the warm, clear waters of the Mediterranean? The very accuracy of his observations made them sound like lies to readers who had no frame of reference for such phenomena. The inhabitants of Tula, Pytheas wrote, were farmers and beekeepers who stored grain in covered barns against the long darkness of winter. They lived simply but prosperously, surviving in a land where the sun disappeared for months at a time and where the sea itself seemed to turn solid. These details were specific enough to suggest genuine observation, yet strange enough to fuel centuries of debate about whether Pytheas had actually visited such a place or simply invented it to enhance his reputation as an explorer. The problem was that Pytheas was trying to describe wonders that had no equivalent in the Mediterranean world. The midnight sun was completely unknown to Greek readers, and the concept of sea ice was beyond their experience. The very phenomena that proved Pytheas had travelled far beyond the known world also made his account sound like pure fiction to sceptical audiences back home. His contemporaries were harsh in their judgment. Strabo, the great geographer, dismissed Pytheas as a liar and a fantasist. Polybius accused him of fabricating his northern adventures to impress gullible listeners. These criticisms were devastating and long-lasting. For centuries, educated opinion held that Tula was nothing more than a Greek sailor's tall tale, a northern version of the impossible adventures described in Homer's Odyssey. But the name itself proved remarkably durable. Even scholars who dismissed Pytheas as a fraud continued to use Thule as a symbol of ultimate remoteness. Roman poets like Virgil made Ultima Thule, farthest Thule, into a standard phrase meaning the most distant possible place, the edge of the world where civilization ended and the unknown began. Medieval scribes copying ancient texts preserved the name even when they had no clear idea what it referred to or where it might be located. As European exploration expanded during the Middle Ages, each new discovery in the northern Atlantic was hailed as a potential candidate for the true Thule. When Irish monks reached Iceland in the 8th century, some scholars immediately proclaimed it the land Pytheas had described. The timing seemed perfect. Iceland had the midnight sun, the strange sea conditions could be explained by surrounding ice and fog, and the latitude roughly matched what could be calculated from Pytheas's fragmentary account. But other locations had equally strong claims. The Faroe Islands lay in approximately the right position and were inhabited by people who practiced agriculture and animal husbandry, matching some of Pytheas's descriptions. Norway's Lofoten Islands were famous for their dramatic summer light and could be reached by the kind of voyage Pytheas described. Even Shetland, Orkney, and the northern tip of Scotland had their advocates, each marshalling evidence from the ancient texts to support their particular theory. The debate intensified during the Renaissance as scholars tried to reconcile classical geography with expanding knowledge of the world. Medieval mapmakers began placing Thule in various locations, sometimes showing it as a large island, sometimes as part of the continental mainland, always positioned at the northern edge of the habitable world. These maps reflected not just geographical uncertainty, but also the symbolic importance of Thule as the ultimate frontier. The most influential medieval interpretation came from Adam of Bremen, an 11th century Saxon monk who confidently identified Thule with Iceland. Adam's account combined classical sources with contemporary reports from traders and missionaries who had actually visited Iceland, making his identification seem authoritative and convincing. For many medieval readers, Adam's work finally solved the mystery of Thule's location. But even this confident identification couldn't end the debate. As European knowledge of northern geography continued to expand, new candidates for Thule kept emerging. When Vikings established settlements in Greenland, some argued that this vast island must be Pytheas's destination. When explorers reached Spitsbergen and other Arctic islands, these too were proposed as possible locations for the mysterious land. The fundamental problem was that Pytheas's original account had been filtered through centuries of copying, translation, and interpretation. Key details had been lost or garbled, distances were recorded in units that were difficult to convert to modern measurements, and the entire narrative was embedded in a worldview that differed dramatically from that of later ages. Each generation of scholars had to interpret the ancient texts through the lens of their own geographical knowledge and cultural assumptions. During the Age of Exploration, several major expeditions set out with the explicit goal of finding and identifying Thule. Danish explorers, building on Adam of Bremen's identification of Thule with Iceland, conducted detailed surveys of the North Atlantic region. English navigators, following up on theories that placed Thule somewhere in the waters north of Scotland, mapped the Orkney and Shetland Islands with unprecedented accuracy. Dutch and Norwegian expeditions pushed even further north, reaching Spitsbergen and the edge of the Arctic ice pack in their search for the ultimate Thule. These expeditions succeeded in mapping much of the North Atlantic, but they also revealed the impossibility of finding a single location that matched all of Pytheas' descriptions. Every proposed site had some features that fit the ancient account and others that clearly didn't. Iceland had the midnight sun and the right latitude, but it lacked the agricultural society Pytheas described and was uninhabited during his era. Norway had farming communities and the right general location, but it wasn't an island and didn't match the specific geographical details. The Faroe Islands were islands with agriculture, but they were too far south to experience the extreme daylight conditions Pytheas reported. A major turning point came in the 18th century when scholars began applying rigorous scientific methods to the Thule question. Astronomers calculated the precise latitudes where Pytheas' description of the midnight sun would be accurate, ruling out many previously proposed locations. Historians compared different versions of the ancient texts, trying to separate original observations from later additions and interpretations. Geographers studied ocean currents, climate patterns, and ice formations to understand what Pytheas might have encountered during his voyage. These scientific approaches revealed both the accuracy and the limitations of Pytheas' account. His description of the midnight sun was remarkably precise and could only have come from direct observation north of the Arctic Circle. His account of thick sea was an excellent description of the ice-filled waters around the Arctic margins. His notes about tides and seasonal changes showed genuine understanding of northern maritime conditions. But the same scientific analysis made it clear that no single location could account for all of Pytheas' observations. The most likely explanation was that he'd compiled his account of Thule from multiple sources, direct observation of some northern region, combined with stories told by local people about places even further north, perhaps mixed with a degree of artistic license to create a more compelling narrative. Modern scholarship has largely accepted that Thule was probably not a specific place, but rather a composite creation that combined real, geographical knowledge with second-hand reports and literary imagination. This doesn't make Pytheas a liar or fraud as his ancient critics claimed. Instead, it reveals him as a skilled navigator and observer who pushed the boundaries of geographical knowledge while also creating one of history's most enduring symbols of the unknown frontier. The search for the historical Thule has never officially ended, but it has evolved into something quite different from the original quest. Modern archaeologists and historians continue to investigate early European contacts with the Arctic regions, trying to understand what northern peoples Pytheas might have encountered and what routes he might have followed. Climate scientists study ancient weather patterns to understand how Arctic conditions might have differed during Pytheas' era. Linguists analyze place names and cultural terms to trace possible connections between ancient Greek accounts and northern European traditions. Today we understand that Pytheas' achievement was not the discovery of a specific mysterious island, but the demonstration that the world was far larger and stranger than anyone had imagined. His voyage proved that there were inhabited lands beyond the edge of the known world, that the sun behaved differently at extreme latitudes, and that the ocean itself could take on forms that Mediterranean peoples had never dreamed of. Thule became lasting proof that there were always new frontiers to explore, new mysteries to solve, new horizons calling to the curious and the brave. The island of Saxenberg, the captain's secret. In the vast emptiness of the South Atlantic Ocean, roughly halfway between the Cape of Good Hope and the island of St. Helena, lies one of geography's most intriguing mysteries. For over a century, maps showed an island called Saxenberg in these waters, a substantial piece of land that Dutch captain John Lindeman claimed to have discovered in 1670. But when modern explorers went looking for this island with advanced technology, they found only empty ocean. The question that has fascinated scientists for decades is simple yet profound. Could an entire island simply vanish from the face of the Earth? And if so, what does this tell us about the dynamic nature of our planet's surface? The scientific community has long been captivated by Saxemberg Island because it challenges our understanding of how land masses behave over geological time. Unlike other phantom islands that can be easily explained as navigation errors or optical illusions, Saxemberg was described with remarkable consistency and detail. Captain Lindemann reported seeing it twice on separate voyages, describing hills rising about 1,000 feet above sea level, lush vegetation in the valleys, fresh water streams, and abundant bird life. This level of detail suggests he observed something real, but what he saw has never been found again. To understand what might have happened to Saxemberg Island, scientists have had to examine the geological forces that shape our planet's surface. The South Atlantic is far from being a quiet, stable region. It sits along the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, one of the most active spreading centers on Earth, where new oceanic crust is constantly being created as tectonic plates pull apart. This underwater mountain range stretches for thousands of miles down the center of the Atlantic Ocean, marked by frequent volcanic activity and seismic events that can dramatically alter the seafloor. The area where Saxemberg was supposed to exist lies within a complex zone of underwater volcanic activity. Deep beneath the ocean surface, molten rock rises from the Earth's mantle, creating new crust and sometimes building underwater mountains that can reach toward the surface. In rare cases, these volcanic formations can actually break through the water's surface to create temporary islands. These volcanic islands can appear suddenly, exist for months or even years, and then disappear just as quickly when the volcanic activity stops and erosion takes over. One of the most compelling theories about Saxemberg involves the formation of what geologists call a pumice island. When underwater volcanoes erupt, they often produce enormous quantities of pumice, a lightweight volcanic rock filled with gas bubbles that allows it to float on water. These pumice rafts can be massive, sometimes covering hundreds of square miles of ocean surface. From a distance, especially to 17th century sailors unfamiliar with the phenomenon, a large pumice raft could easily be mistaken for a solid island. What makes pumice islands particularly interesting is their behaviour over time. Fresh pumice can float for months or even years, gradually accumulating seaweed, debris, and even bird droppings that can create the appearance of vegetation from a distance. Birds often land on these floating masses to rest during long ocean flights, adding to the illusion of a living ecosystem. Eventually, however, the pumice becomes waterlogged and sinks, taking the entire island to the ocean floor. To investigate what really happened in the waters where Saxemberg was reported, modern scientists have employed an arsenal of advanced technologies that Captain Lindemann could never have imagined. High-resolution sonar mapping has revealed the detailed topography of the ocean floor in the region, showing underwater mountains and valleys with precision measured in meters. These sonar surveys have found no evidence of any landmass that could have supported Lindemann's descriptions, but they have revealed something equally fascinating: a landscape of underwater volcanic features that tells the story of intense geological activity. Satellite imaging has provided another crucial piece of the puzzle. Advanced satellites can detect subtle differences in water colour and temperature that might indicate the presence of underwater features or unusual geological activity. When scientists analysed decades of satellite data from the Saxemberg region, they found no trace of any island, but they did discover evidence of occasional volcanic activity on the seafloor and periodic changes in water chemistry that suggest ongoing geological processes. Perhaps most importantly, scientists have been able to collect sediment cores from the ocean floor in the area where Saxemberg was supposed to exist. These cores, extracted by drilling deep into the seafloor, contain layers of sediment that have accumulated over thousands of years, creating a detailed record of the region's geological history. Analysis of these cores has revealed multiple layers of volcanic ash and pumice, confirming that the area has experienced repeated episodes of underwater volcanic activity over the centuries. The sediment cores also contain microscopic fossils that help scientists understand how ocean conditions have changed over time. These tiny organisms are sensitive to water temperature, chemistry, and other environmental factors, so their presence or absence in different layers of sediment can reveal important information about past volcanic events. In the Saxemberg region, the fossil record shows clear evidence of periodic volcanic disruptions that would have been capable of creating temporary islands. Marine geologists who have studied the Saxemberg mystery point to several key factors that make the disappearing island theory scientifically plausible. The Mid-Atlantic Ridge System is known for producing episodic volcanic events that can create temporary land masses. The specific location where Saxonburg was reported sits above a particularly active section of the ridge, where underwater volcanic mountains rise to within a few hundred meters of the surface. Under the right conditions, increased volcanic activity could easily push one of these underwater peaks above sea level, creating a temporary island. Oceanographers have also contributed important insights about the unique conditions in the South Atlantic that could support the formation and disappearance of temporary islands. The region experiences complex current patterns that can concentrate floating volcanic material into large, stable formations. These currents can also affect how quickly such formations break apart and sink, potentially explaining why Saxonburg might have persisted long enough for Lindemann to see it twice, but then vanished before other explorers could confirm its existence. Climate scientists have added another dimension to the investigation by studying historical weather patterns in the South Atlantic. Their research suggests that the late 17th century was a period of increased volcanic activity in the region, possibly triggered by climate fluctuations that affected ocean temperatures and currents. This increased volcanic activity would have made the formation of temporary islands more likely during exactly the period when Lindemann reported his discovery. The implications of the Saxonburg mystery extend far beyond the question of one missing island. If scientists are correct that temporary islands can form and disappear in the South Atlantic, it suggests that our planet's surface is far more dynamic than most people realize. The idea that substantial pieces of land can appear and vanish within human lifetimes challenges traditional thinking about geological timescales and the permanence of geographical features. This research has also revealed important information about the frequency and scale of volcanic activity in the South Atlantic. The evidence suggests that underwater eruptions capable of creating temporary islands may occur more often than previously thought, with major implications for understanding oceanic geology and the formation of permanent island chains. Some scientists now believe that many of the permanent islands in the South Atlantic may have started as temporary volcanic formations that eventually became stable enough to persist. The Saxonburg investigation has also contributed to our understanding of how pumice rafts behave in ocean environments. These floating volcanic formations play important roles in marine ecosystems, serving as transportation for marine organisms across vast ocean distances and creating temporary habitats for seabirds and other wildlife. Understanding how these formations develop and disperse helps scientists better predict their environmental impacts. From a historical perspective, the scientific investigation of Saxonburg has revealed how geological processes can influence human history in unexpected ways. If Lindemann really did see a temporary volcanic island, his discovery represents a unique moment when geological and human history intersected. The island's disappearance before other explorers could confirm it may have prevented the establishment of a permanent settlement or trading post that could have altered the course of South Atlantic exploration. The Saxonburg mystery also demonstrates how modern scientific techniques can be applied to solve historical puzzles. The combination of geological analysis, satellite imagery, sediment core sampling, and computer modelling has created a comprehensive picture of what might have happened in 1670, even though no direct evidence of the island remains. This interdisciplinary approach shows how different scientific fields can work together to understand complex phenomena. Perhaps most significantly, the investigation of Saxonburg has revealed that phantom islands may not always be phantoms in the traditional sense. While many historical reports of mysterious islands can be explained as navigation errors or optical illusions, some may represent genuine observations of temporary geological features. This possibility has led scientists to reconsider other historical reports of vanishing islands, applying similar investigative techniques to understand what early explorers might actually have seen. Bermeja, the vanishing island of the Gulf. In the summer of 2008, a team of Mexican government officials sat in a windowless conference room in Mexico City, staring at a problem that would cost their country 22.5 billion barrels of oil. Spread across the table were maritime charts, satellite images, and GPS coordinates that should have pointed to a small island called Bermeja, Mexico's northernmost territory in the Gulf of Mexico. This tiny piece of land was crucial for establishing the country's maritime boundaries and More importantly, their rights to drill for oil in some of the Gulf's richest waters. But when Mexican surveyors sailed to the exact coordinates where Bermeja should have been floating in the blue waters of the Gulf, they found absolutely nothing. No island, no rocks, no coral reef, just empty ocean stretching to the horizon. This wasn't some ancient mystery from the age of exploration. This was a modern crisis unfolding in real time, with billions of dollars hanging in the balance. Mexican officials found themselves in the embarrassing position of having to explain to their American counterparts why a key piece of their territorial claim had simply vanished. The United States, meanwhile, suddenly found themselves with access to vast underwater territories that had previously belonged to Mexico. Oil companies began eyeing drilling rights that had shifted from one nation to another overnight, all because of an island that may never have existed at all. The mystery of Bermeja begins not with its discovery, but with its disappearance, and the trail of evidence that suggests this vanishing act had been centuries in the making. To understand how an entire island could disappear from the map, we need to go back to the beginning of the story, when Spanish explorers first began charting the dangerous waters of the Gulf of Mexico. The earliest mention of Bermeja appears on Spanish colonial maps dating back to 1539, just decades after Cortés conquered the Aztec Empire. Spanish cartographers, working with information gathered from coastal expeditions and fishing vessels, marked a small island at coordinates 22°33' north, 91°22' west. The island appeared consistently on map after map, generation after generation, as Spanish, Dutch, British, and eventually Mexican cartographers dutifully copied its location onto their charts. What made Bermeja different from many other islands marked on early maps was its remarkable consistency. While other geographical features often shifted location or changed shape as cartographers refined their knowledge, Bermeja remained stubbornly fixed in the same spot. Spanish naval records from the colonial period reference the island as a navigation landmark. Fishing captains used it as a reference point for finding good waters. Government inventories listed it as official Mexican territory. By the 19th century, Bermeja had become an established fact of geography. It appeared in official Mexican territorial surveys, international boundary agreements, and maritime navigation guides. The island seemed so well documented and widely accepted that nobody thought to question whether it actually existed. After all, if it was on every map used by countless sailors and recognized by multiple governments, how could it not be real? The first cracks in Bermeja's reality began to appear in the late 20th century as navigation technology improved. Satellite imagery was becoming more detailed and widely available, and GPS systems allowed ships to pinpoint their location with unprecedented accuracy. When Mexican naval vessels began using these new technologies to conduct routine surveys of their territorial waters, they made a disturbing discovery. The coordinates that should have led them to Bermeja led them only to empty ocean. At first, officials assumed there was some kind of technical error. Perhaps the GPS was malfunctioning or the satellite images were unclear. They sent multiple ships to search the area, equipped with sonar mapping equipment, underwater cameras, and diving gear. The crews methodically searched not just the exact coordinates where Bermeja was supposed to be, but the entire surrounding region. They looked for any sign that an island had once existed there. Coral formations, unusual depths, debris fields, anything that might explain what had happened. The results were consistently disappointing. The seafloor in the area appeared completely normal, with no evidence that any land mass had ever existed there. The water depth was uniform, the bottom was covered with typical Gulf sediment, and marine life showed no signs of unusual formations or disturbances. If Bermeja had ever been real, it had vanished without leaving any trace. As word of the missing island spread, local fishermen and coastal residents began sharing their own stories. Some elderly fishermen from the Yucatan coast claimed they remembered hearing their grandfathers talk about a small island in the northern Gulf, though none could provide specific details or evidence. Others insisted they had never heard of any such island, despite spending their entire lives working these waters. A few boat captains came forward with more intriguing claims. They spoke of seeing something in the general area where Bermeja was supposed to be, not necessarily an island, but unusual water conditions, large flocks of seabirds, or changes in wave patterns that might indicate shallow water or underwater formations. However, when pressed for specifics, none could provide exact coordinates, photographs, or other crew members who could confirm their stories. The most dramatic testimony came from an aging fisherman named Carlos Morales, who claimed his father had actually landed on Bermeja in the 1940s. According to Morales, his father described it as a small, sandy island barely above sea level, covered with seabirds and surrounded by excellent fishing waters. But when researchers tried to verify this account, they discovered that Morales' father had died decades earlier, and no one else in the family could confirm the story. These eyewitness accounts, while intriguing, shared a common problem. They were all vague, unverifiable, and came from people who had clear reasons to support the idea that Bermeja had existed. Local communities stood to benefit economically if Mexico could maintain its claims to the northern Gulf territories, creating an incentive for people to remember or imagine evidence of the missing island. The Mexican government, faced with the potential loss of billions of dollars in oil revenues, launched an unprecedented scientific investigation into the Bermeja mystery. They assembled teams of marine geologists, oceanographers, and archaeological experts to conduct the most thorough search ever undertaken for a missing island. The first phase involved detailed satellite analysis. Researchers examined decades of satellite imagery from the coordinates where Bermeja was supposed to exist, looking for any sign of land, shallow water, or unusual oceanographic features. They studied images taken during different seasons, weather conditions, and tidal states, hoping to catch a glimpse of an island that might only be visible under certain circumstances. The satellite investigation revealed nothing unusual about the area. Water depth was consistent with the surrounding region. There were no colour variations that might indicate coral reefs or underwater formations, and no objects visible on the surface that could be mistaken for land. The second phase involved direct oceanographic surveys using the most advanced equipment available. Research vessels equipped with multi-beam sonar systems created detailed three-dimensional maps of the seafloor. Underwater robots collected sediment samples and photographed the bottom. Marine biologists studied the local ecosystem for any signs of unusual formations or historical disturbances. The sonar mapping revealed a completely ordinary section of Gulf seafloor, sandy bottom, gentle slopes, and typical marine geology for the region. Sediment core samples showed normal layers of accumulated material with no evidence of recent geological activity or artificial disturbance. The marine ecosystem appeared healthy and undisturbed, with no signs of the kind of disruption that might result from an island collapsing or being destroyed. Teams of professional divers were sent down to personally examine the area where Bermeja was supposed to exist. They searched methodically, looking for any physical evidence, coral formations, unusual rock structures, debris, anything that might explain the missing island. Despite extensive underwater exploration, they found nothing out of the ordinary. The third phase of the investigation involved historical research, as scientists tried to trace the origin of Bermeja's appearance on maps. They examined original Spanish colonial documents, early navigation charts, and maritime records from multiple countries. What they discovered was troubling. While Bermeja appeared consistently on maps, there was very little detailed documentation of anyone actually visiting or studying the island. Most map references to Bermeja were simply copied from earlier maps, creating a chain of cartographic repetition that stretched back centuries. When researchers tried to find the original source, the first explorer or navigator who had actually documented the island based on direct observation, the trail went cold. It seemed that Bermeja's existence had been accepted based on nothing more than its repeated appearance on charts. As the scientific evidence mounted, several theories emerged to explain the Bermeja mystery. The most straightforward explanation was that the island had never existed at all, that it was a cartographic error that had been repeated for centuries. Perhaps some 16th century navigator had misidentified a whale, a floating mass of seaweed, or distant clouds as an island. Once this mistake appeared on an official Spanish chart, it would have been copied onto subsequent maps without verification. This theory was supported by the complete lack of physical evidence and the absence of detailed historical records about the island. However, it raised uncomfortable questions about how such an error could persist for so long and be accepted by so many different governments and navigation authorities. A second theory suggested that Bermeja might have been a temporary natural formation, a sandbar, coral reef, or volcanic formation that existed for a period of time before being eroded away by storms, currents, or geological activity. The Gulf of Mexico is geologically active, with underwater earthquakes, sediment shifts, and changing currents that could theoretically create and destroy small land formations. However, geological surveys found no evidence of such processes in the Bermeja area. The seafloor showed no signs of recent geological activity, and the sediment layers indicated stable conditions over long periods of time. The most controversial theory involved human intervention. Some Mexican politicians and conspiracy theorists suggested that Bermeja had been deliberately destroyed by foreign agents, possibly the CIA, to shift maritime boundaries in favour of the United States. They pointed out that the island's disappearance coincided perfectly with negotiations over oil drilling rights worth billions of dollars. This theory gained enough traction that 6 Mexican senators demanded an official investigation into the possibility of foreign sabotage. However, military experts pointed out that destroying an entire island would require massive amounts of explosives and would leave obvious evidence of destruction on the seafloor. No such evidence was found despite extensive searches. A fourth theory proposed that Bermeja had been mislocated on early maps, and that the real island existed somewhere else in the Gulf. This would explain why searches at the traditional coordinates found nothing. Everyone was looking in the wrong place. However, extensive searches of surrounding areas turned up no likely candidates for a misplaced island. The investigation also revealed troubling questions about the reliability of geographical knowledge in general. If an island could appear on official maps for centuries without anyone verifying its existence, what did that say about other remote territories marked on charts around the world? How many other geographical features might be based on cartographic errors rather than actual observation? Today, more than a decade after the mystery first made headlines, Bermeja remains one of the most puzzling cases in modern geography. Mexican authorities have quietly removed the island from new maps and no longer claim it as territory, though they have never formally declared it fictional. The maritime boundary between Mexico and the United States remains as negotiated, based on the assumption that Bermeja does not exist. American oil companies have begun exploring their newly acquired drilling rights in the northern Gulf, while the 22.5 billion barrels of oil that Mexico lost continue to generate controversy in Mexican politics. Some politicians still raise the Bermeja issue as evidence of how their country has been disadvantaged in international negotiations. The island of Bayern, the Slavic mirage. Close your eyes and listen to the wind. In the vast forests of Russia, when the morning mist rises from ancient lakes and the pine trees whisper secrets that have been passed down through countless generations, you might hear something calling from beyond the edge of the world. It's not the sound of any earthly breeze, but the voice of an island that exists in a realm between dreams and waking, between the last word of a story and the first light of dawn. This is Bayern, the most extraordinary phantom island that ever was, because it never pretended to be real in the way that maps and merchants understand reality. Long ago, when the world was young and the boundary between the possible and impossible was as thin as morning frost, the gods themselves needed a place to rest. They created Bayern in the middle of the ocean sea, at the very centre of all things, where the waters of creation first began to flow. This was no ordinary island carved from rock and coral, but a sacred place woven from starlight and song, from the breath of sleeping giants and the tears of joy shed by the first storytellers. At the heart of Bayern stands the Alatir, the white stone that is father to all stones, the sacred centre around which the entire world spins. From this mighty stone, rivers of healing water flow in all directions, carrying away sorrow and pain, washing clean the wounds of the world. The Alatir bears writing in letters that no human alphabet contains, symbols that shift and change like clouds in the wind, words that can only be read by the heart. Some say these are the true names of all things, the words that were spoken when the world was made and everything was still possible. The island's shores are guarded by creatures of wonder and terror. Gamayun, the prophetic bird with the face of a beautiful woman, soars above Bayern's waters, carrying messages between the living